You can run from the United States Marshals, but you cannot hide.
Kidnapping, controlling the minds of his followers, cheating the IRS of millions of dollars, even beating a child. These are some of the shocking allegations hanging over the head of
the Jesus Children from the Susan and Tony Alamo Christian Foundation. Their commune's main source of income's received when a convert sells his earthly goods and hands in the money.
Thank you for tuning this way, and would you please stay with us for the next half hour?
The year was 1969, and amid the Vietnam War, many people, especially younger hippie types, were united in politics but feeling disillusioned and lost in society. So naturally, they picked up and moved to California, as one does. At the same time, the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in Hollywood went out on the streets to recruit these people, mainly on Hollywood Boulevard. Tony would preach in public, and his seemingly more progressive ideologies, such as everyone being accepted no matter their race, gender, or financial situation, would draw in crowds. Repent or perish, devote your life to the Lord, he would preach to people who had never before been interested in religion or had even been adverse to the idea were starting to take interest. What started off as curiosity soon led to dedication. Young people were inviting their friends, and the younger crowd attracted even more people. Tony went from singing top hits on the radio to belting out gospel lyrics in the pews and on the streets. Tony and Susan broadcast their ministry on television to reach an even wider audience.
Hello there again. We're Tony and Susan Alamo. Stay right in there with us for the next 1/2 hour with gospel testimonies, songs, and a message.
Susan initially started the foundation. Originally having dreams of being on the big screen, she had moved to Los Angeles from a small town in Arkansas. Her first job in LA consisted of sitting at a bar, attracting men to buy drinks for her, therefore profiting the business. She did extremely well. Her presence was enchantingly captivating. She was the type to turn heads when she walked in a room. Somewhere along the way, she became more drawn to religion and the church. Susan would take her daughter Chris to church where the young girl would sing and Susan would preach. At times, Susan would share the story of she and her daughter traveling to Mexico to spread the word of the Lord, but that was entirely a farce. Now, Susan did find her way to the big screen, albeit not the way she expected. This preaching, singing gig became she and her daughter's full-time job, and eventually they were on television. As her daughter grew, reaching 18 years old, Susan started throwing her at the music industry. It was as if she were living vicariously through her daughter, wanting to ride on the coattails of the successes she felt that she had never achieved. One evening, mother and daughter go to a bar where they meet Tony Alamo. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri, to a Jewish family. At just 9 years old, he was abandoned at a home for boys in Nebraska where he was bullied for his faith. After growing up and aging out of the foster system, he picked up and moved to California. In Hollywood, he was convicted of theft, burglary, and rape before he was even old enough to drink. He changed his name several times until finally deciding upon his well-known moniker, Tony Alamo. His changing identity also matched his differing life stories. And this was just the beginning of Tony's untruths. He claimed to be a famous record producer, promoting the Beatles and major motion pictures, but in reality, he was broke. It was widely known that Tony hated women, but back at the bar, he's completely into Susan and tells her all about his work in the music industry, while she tells him all about the gospel. He had never been super religious, but sitting here so into Susan, he was willing to listen to her talk about just about anything. He did start to eventually gain an interest in Christianity, but more so, he fell deeply in love with Susan, even calling her the greatest lady that ever lived. And even more than that, he was smitten with the prospect of building an empire together. It wasn't long before they went to Las Vegas in 1966 and were wed as a married couple. Back on the streets of LA, they preached together, behind the scenes akinning it to cleaning up the nasty streets. Susan would use her captivating charm to reel them in, and Tony would use his charisma to steal their business. The couple would baptize followers in the Pacific Ocean on the spot, whom they then called the Jesus Children. They would tell their followers that they had to sell all of their possessions and donate the proceeds to the church. Susan would deny that their motivation was greed, stating that most people who joined had a little more than the clothes on their back to begin with. After all, they were hippies.
Most of them don't have a thing. I'll make a deal with you. Every hippie that comes to the church with money and possessions, I'll put salt and pepper on him and eat them if you'll eat the other ones. Would you do that? Most of them don't even have shoes on their feet.
While that is slightly true, it wasn't the case for everyone. Some of the members were extremely wealthy, and the Alamos had dollar signs in their eyes. They would hone in on these members specifically, telling them that they had an enormous amount of potential. Only a year into the couple-led foundation, Tony and Susan had moved over 200 of their devout followers into their just 3-bedroom home. In addition to the residents of the home, even more members would come regularly throughout the day, and the cops came by often due to complaints of unsanitary conditions. The neighbors were understandably uncomfortable with all of these people coming and going, because why do you have hundreds of people in and out of your house, and what are they doing? Susan and Tony didn't like the police snooping into their business, so they purchased a property about 45 minutes north of Los Angeles and procured the title of a nonprofit, mainly so that they would be exempt from income tax. This not only made it easy to avoid the authorities, but to separate the followers from any connections that they had to their former lives, aka reality. Even family members that joined together were often separated in day-to-day life. In the home, 20 to 30 people were assigned per room to sleep in bunks. The house had no running water, and babies were expected to use cloth diapers when, not properly washed, would breed maggots. And mind you, there were a lot of babies with all the members and no birth control. It was basically an inevitable consequence, one even encouraged by Susan and Tony. It was growing their army and giving rise to a new generation that had never experienced life outside this, let's say, cult, because let's call it what it is. All of the kids would call Tony Papa, and they loved him because they saw him as the one providing food, shelter, clothing, etc., the few times they would get it, and not from their parents. On the other hand, they feared Susan because she, after all, was a prophet of God, capital H, him.
I was just out in the world and I was really lost. And she looked at me in the eyes and she said, "You know it's the truth." And that just sunk right deep inside of my heart, and I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that she had the power of God plus the truth.
She received the word of God, and they all had to listen. Sue was simply just the messenger. Members had to start earning their keep around the compound by cultivating cotton, grapes, roses, all with the proceeds going to the church. Each person would earn an average of $350 per week, and when you take that times a couple hundred people, it adds up really fast. The Alamos, of course, lived in their own roomy home on the property, adorned with fancy cars, pricey antiques. They bought silver and gold and went on expensive vacations. Susan had a particular hunger for expensive fashion that she suddenly had the funds to satiate, and she always had a beer and a cigarette in hand. Tony and Susan began telling members that they weren't contributing enough, they didn't care enough about God, they were lazy and dirty. Gee, I wonder why. They were told things like rape and murder were just a test of faith, and that if they really had faith in God, then they wouldn't fear those things. And it makes sense that Tony would instill this, especially into the young girls, because as it turns out, he was sexually abusing Susan's biological daughter. When bringing this up to her mother, Susan called Chris a liar, so she bottled it up, believing that nobody would ever believe her, so there was no point in reaching out for help. Corporal punishment was something highly encouraged, and the church even had a small room in the back dedicated to Tony and Susan watching and instructing parents on how to spank and literally beat the hell out of the kids. To aid in this process, they used a giant wooden paddle called the Board of Education. If anybody protested or wanted to leave the foundation, you guessed it, they're going to hell. And if any members did manage to escape, but left family behind, their families would take the abuse for them, because they must have the devil in them too, since they're related. Susan claimed to have terminal cancer for many years. Followers believed that she was suffering for their sins, and that the status of her health was in direct correlation to the church's standing with God. If she was doing particularly unwell, she would blame the members, forcing them to pray at her feet. Susan said that she owed her life to God, and because she believed and she prayed and obeyed, God kept her alive. Chances are you probably know somebody in your life who has been affected by cancer in some way, maybe even terminally. So imagine this person you believe is truly a vessel of God speaking directly to you, basically implying that people die because they didn't pray or believe in God enough. Sure, Sue. Unfunnily enough, she actually did get breast cancer years later, which had progressed so far by the time that she caught it that it was inoperable. She definitely looked unwell and even stopped attending service at some point, and it makes you wonder if the followers were starting to question her previous cancer claims. Nonetheless, all they could do at this point was pray for her. Families of the followers would go on TV or to protests condemning the foundation, begging their loved ones to return home, which typically did not make a difference. In fact, Tony and Susan would ensure that the families had no contact. Members who thought of leaving were threatened with eternal damnation, and that was after they would be killed to prevent them from going public with the secrets of the foundation. Susan would say, "If you don't believe me and I end up being wrong about God, then you still lived a heaven-worthy life. But if I'm right and you disobeyed, you're going to hell." Is that a gamble you're really willing to take? Tony and Susan would also appear on TV preaching and singing, while members would give positive testimonials of the church in order to entice new members to join. If you have to clarify with your captive, interviewee, that they are there voluntarily and you keep asking them in a way where it's like, everything is normal, right? Tell them it's normal. Then it's probably a red flag. Despite the couple's best efforts to remove themselves from the eyes of the law by moving to the boonies, it was quite apparent by their TV appearances and success that they were making tons of money. And yet, the members were still scraggly. Police suspected that the members were not being compensated for their work, and as they move in, of course, Susan tells the group that God is directing them to expand and move towards the gospel, which happened to be in the Bible Belt. More specifically, in Alma, Arkansas, where Susan was originally from. If their goal is to spread the word and save people from going to hell, then wouldn't it make more sense to keep preaching to the heathens? Oh yeah, no, because people in the Bible Belt already believe and are therefore easier to extract money from, and plus, she wanted to flaunt her wealth and success to the small town folk that she grew up with. Susan would publicly state that the reason they picked Arkansas specifically was because when she was 9 years old, she had tuberculosis and God descended from the heavens and cured her despite her family being non-believers. Conveniently, the members of the foundation set up shop near the borders of Texas and Oklahoma so that if anyone started prying, it was an easy move across state lines and into different jurisdictions. The foundation also started businesses including gas stations, clothing stores, record companies, candy shops, grocery stores, landscaping, you name it, they had it. They used the members as free labor, often working 15-hour shifts up to 7 days a week. At one point, they had at least 30 businesses across the 3 states. Their accounting was handled in such a way that it was next to impossible to trace, including offshore accounts that were used to avoid taxes on their commercial businesses. Over the span of the next 5 years, they multiplied their yearly earnings over 20 times. All that money, and they weren't paying a single person except themselves. At the same time, Tony and Susan were claiming to lose money, but that they didn't mind because these businesses were simply for the foundation, by the foundation, meant to meet basic needs. They also claimed that the members didn't want to be paid. Any profits would go towards the children, but most of all, the work was to pay back the Alamos and in turn pay back God. Yeah, that's why they're all broke, starving, filthy, and worse off than they were to begin with. The residents of the small town called them weirdos, and in response, the foundation staged these commercial-like photo shoots with members doing various recreational activities, laughing and having fun, and had them published into a book. But of course, it was all fake. So with these fake images combined with the businesses they brought to town, and the public started to think that maybe these people aren't so bad after all. In fact, they were kind of fancy. They even managed to get several famous country singers like Dolly Parton, Roy Orbison, and Tammy Wynette to perform at one of their restaurants, which of course brought in a ton of business. Soon, even celebrities like the Clintons started dining there, and Tony and Susan finally felt like they were on some level of stardom. In 1977, the Department of Labor finally stepped in, claiming that, according to their findings, the Alamos owed their volunteers about $19 million. Once again, in response to this, the foundation felt the need to relocate and acquired a 240-acre gated and guarded compound nearby that they'd call Georgia Ridge. There were constantly lookouts patrolling the premises, and when members walked around, they were required to stay in a buddy system so that they were never alone. When they weren't out working 15-hour shifts or trying to get some shut-eye, they would gather and listen to Tony and Susan preach, either in person or on tape. If any of the members were accused of wrongdoing, a physical report would be made on that individual. People were snitching on each other left and right because even the act of not reporting somebody was deserving of being reported. It was literally yap or go to hell. They would even turn themselves in if they had so much as an unsavory thought, because after all, God was always watching, and he would know regardless. After the report, they would be punished either by being sent to work at the pig farm, being separated from their families, or by being shunned completely. And that's a really scary thought, especially for people who were born into this and literally didn't know anything else, or who had no support systems on the outside. It was the equivalent of being turned away by their creator. I mean, imagine how mentally breaking it would be to be experiencing human trafficking that you're not even really aware of because you're simultaneously under such constant fear of eternal damnation that you will do whatever these prophets say. By the 1980s, the foundation had another television program in addition to their sermon program, which was an advertisement for their commune. In 1982, as Susan reached the tragic end to her cancer journey, she still had the members in a chokehold. They stayed up for days praying for her, and when some of them inevitably fell asleep and Susie passed away on April 8th, they felt as if it were their fault for slacking. That not only did they cause her death, but they were going to hell. Tony also laid blame on the government for her death by sticking their nose into everything and causing stress that would exacerbate her condition. Tony was heartbroken and extremely scared that he could not leave with Susan's fervor. Some of her last words were instructing Tony to just let the people go because even she lacked faith in his leading abilities. There were dozens of businesses, homes, dollars, people to look after, and it was all on him now. To cope with this, he put Susan's casket inside the Georgia Ridge mansion, claiming that she would rise from the dead, just like the Bible said.
I'm praying that God will heal her, raise her from the dead, so that it'll show the power of the Almighty God.
It was like he was waiting for this mighty power that Susan had to leave her body and transfer it into him. You'd think that such a mighty power could travel through dirt and such, so there's not a literal rotting corpse sitting in the living room, but I guess there's like a certain distance you have to be without obstruction, and yeah, I don't know. Anyways, the members would come in the house and pray to her body for her to arise from the dead, and they did this for at least a year. Yep, she was just sitting in the living room, decomposing. Tony started to lose hope and blame the followers for not committing themselves enough. Eventually, the members sat Tony down and told him that he really needed to bury her, so they constructed a heart-shaped mausoleum. Remember back in 1977 when the Department of Labor filed a lawsuit against the foundation for not paying its employees? Well, it finally went to trial in 1982, and Tony had to face the music alone. He argued that it was harassment, that the Department of Labor had no grounds, and that everyone in the foundation was perfectly fine with signing over their earnings, so why was this being made into such a big deal? Members were made to feel afraid of the government, like they were interfering in their mission. It was an all-out war on religion, so the government must be evil. Of course, once questioned, the members spoke positively of their experiences not wanting to be removed. Still, the foundation was required to actually hand over paychecks to the members, including the $19 million in back pay, who could then decide if they wanted to donate them back to the church. Although the foundation was worth about $50 million at this point, Tony was having none of it and appealed against this decision, which prolonged the case. And if that weren't enough, the IRS was onto him too. Tony had always been comfortable with being rich and powerful, but now he was all alone, and the walls seemed to be closing in on him. He was stressed, and he started taking it out on the members who feared his volatility. The kids who once saw him as Papa Tony, the lesser of two evils, now trembled at the ease of which he decided that they'd earned a spanking. He would announce these spankings over the intercom for the whole compound to hear. Then, parents or other adults would hold the child, while another adult used the Board of Education like a baseball bat to, quote, chop wood. If they didn't do it hard enough, according to God, then the adults were threatened with the same punishment. One story recounts a boy being beaten with the Board of Education approximately 200 times to the point that his jeans were soaked through with blood. A lot of the times kids were punished over menial things that normal kids do. Other times Tony would make up things just to see these beatings happen. And of course, if the kids denied doing these things that they didn't do, that was calling Tony a liar, which would end in punishment regardless. Tony started to threaten to leave the foundation under the instruction of God, and the members were like, okay, are you gonna die? Or are you gonna leave? Are you gonna leave us all to go to hell? I don't know. It's kind of giving threatening suicide to manipulate and get what you want. Tony wasn't really talking about death though. He just started taking a lot of trips out of town often, and during many of these trips, he would travel back to Los Angeles. And it was here where he became interested in a Swedish fashion designer, Birgitta Gyllenhammar. Fun fact, Mrs. Gyllenhammar looked like a spitting image of Susan herself, and this was no coincidence. Tony wooed her with his riches, but most of all, he was gentlemanly enough to which he won her over. They soon got married, and she moved to Arkansas to the Georgia Ridge compound. Members were initially confused because who is this lady? She wasn't even religious, let alone a pastor. She didn't really believe his story about being a prophet of God. She just liked him for him. I mean, they were at it like 3 times a day. The only bad thing about that being that if it were any less, then he would start beating her. What kept her from leaving for a long time was her passion for fashion and the fact that she relied heavily on Tony's financial support. Her passion was also the inspiration for Tony Alamo designs, which were extremely trendy, custom airbrushed and bedazzled jean jackets with the Alamo Alamo name in the details. His new line of fashion made him feel really good and confident, and Birgitta helped him get into the New York fashion scene. It wasn't long before the kids of the foundation were bussed to a factory where they worked in sweatshop-like conditions, making these jackets until all hours of the night. They were never paid, they never got to keep a jacket, and they definitely weren't aware of just how much money these jackets were making. Within just days of being in stores, they were selling and making Tony millions of dollars. Even celebrities were wearing them, which made Tony seem even more legit. Michael Jackson wore one of these jackets on the cover of his album, Bad. In 1985, the Supreme Court finally backed the Department of Labor's decision against the foundation and declared that Tony had to pay back the employees $19 million and continue to pay them for their labor. That same year, the IRS saw all of the fancy things that Tony had on his property and revoked the foundation's status as a tax-exempt nonprofit, which meant he owed $7.9 million in back taxes. After 2 years of marriage, Tony's wife filed for divorce despite his threats to kill her and send her to hell. The main reason being that he had taken an interest in polygamy and started looking at young girls as potential suitresses. I'd run too, girl. Tony sent members after her to threaten her for a very long time, and she was understandably afraid. Tony started expanding the foundation by sending members across the country to Houston, New York, and Miami under the guise of spreading the word of the Lord. In reality, they were getting into real estate and such, things to make them richer, but they did attract some followers along the way. At this point, a couple of fathers, known as the Miller brothers, could no longer stand to see kids getting beaten any longer, and one night they ran away with the intention of coming back to rescue their children. It would be hard because they weren't able to convince their wives that it was the right thing to do, but after the brothers had attempted to sneak out their kids one night, Tony Alamo had the children taken to the California compound to live at the original commune. This was legally considered kidnapping, and the fathers went to the court, and with the help of the police, the California compound was raided, and the kids were reunited with their fathers.
It's hard to explain, but it's like claustrophobia in your whole life.
After telling the police and the public all about the Board of Education, Tony was charged with child abuse, but he was out gallivanting, so the police weren't able to locate and arrest him. But that did not stop the Miller brothers from suing the Alamo Foundation, along with Tony's many businesses in Arkansas. Tony went on the run, sending tapes to each of his headquarters to disseminate sermons and give orders, all while remaining untraceable. This went on for 2 years, and he didn't show up to court on his trial date, ultimately being found liable for fraud, abuse, and torment against the Millers, who were to be awarded $1.8 million. Tony obviously wasn't just going to hand this over, so the U.S. Marshal, State Police, and County Sheriff prepared to raid the Georgia compound and seize his property to go towards the settlement owed. Tony informed his followers that they needed to flee because the FBI was going to storm in and kill them. His followers were reasonably fearful and started gathering weapons. When the cops did get there, people stopped what they were doing and ran away, terrified, into the woods. As the cops were checking out the property, they noticed the mausoleum, which they didn't think much of at first until they noticed that a side of it had been broken open. Tony had hired some men to go disrupt Susan from her eternal slumber, throw her desecrated remains into a van, and just drive off. Susan's biological daughter had left the church years before, and once she found out about her mother's body being stolen, she did not hesitate to sue Tony.
All I want you to do is return her so we can bury her, just like a decent human being.
At this point, the followers obviously cannot return to the ridge, so they scattered across the country in smaller communities, starting from scratch and continuing to receive tapes from Tony. In addition to these tapes, Tony also corresponded with a journalist about the judge who had made the decision, saying that he would try Judge Arnold in God's court, where he'd be hanged, after a fair trial, of course. Ooh, he's shaking in his boots. In addition, he also said that he had Susan's body and that it was his. The journalist published all of this to the newspaper, and as soon as the FBI read the thing about George Arnold, they're like, yeah, this is a threat. And this is not good for Tony, who's already a fugitive for child abuse on the FBI's most wanted list. Authorities used phone records of Foundation members and noticed a pattern of calls coming from Tampa regularly. They tracked it to a house that they ended up surveying, and on July 5th, 1991, authorities watched as the front door swung open and Tony Alamo whisked out to retrieve the morning newspaper. As he returned in his home, none the wiser, police were quick to bust down the door and arrest him at the breakfast table. When Tony asked them how they possibly found him, the officers responded that the Lord had led them to him. However, there were no signs of Susan's remains. Tony was extradited back to Arkansas to go to trial for the child abuse charges, as well as civil contempt, tax evasion, and the threatening of the life of the federal judge. When it came to the threat, he was acquitted. The jurors did not want this to look like a revocation of religious freedom, but Tony still had other charges to face. In the meantime, he made his $200,000 bail for the time being. The so-called Teflon pastor once again started wrangling up members in Fort Smith, Arkansas, just for good old time's sake. The members had actually missed this life. They had gotten used to it over the decades. They started reconvening, and Tony would start doing sermons in person again. He gained followers despite standing at the lectern preaching with an ankle monitor on. They all believed Tony when he said he had been framed by the evil government. This time around, he started talking about the end of the world, telling the members that they were the chosen ones for the end times. In 1994, Tony was convicted of all tax-related charges and sentenced to 6 years in prison. He had no problems running the foundation from inside his cell, where he communicated through the phone, and members kept on working and donating all of the money to him. Tony really started leaning into the polygamy angle, talking about how girls became women when they reached puberty. He said that women were actually the sexual ones and that they were the ones to lead men on. He said it was completely normal for a girl to have had sex up to 1,000 times by the time that they reached the age of 15. He had young women, aka little girls, that were secretaries of his personal office and lived inside of his home full time. They were all his wives. God had said that they were created to be so. Tony told all of his followers with children to relocate to a new compound in Arkansas that was near where he would be released from prison. Can you see where this is going? His wives visited him in prison and gave him all the tea that was going on. He instructed his wives to take pictures of the kids, which is especially disturbing when you consider that he was scoping out his newest wives. Before his release in 1998, cops wanted to know where Susan Alamo's body was. If Tony didn't spill the beans, they promised to rearrest him as soon as he stepped out of prison on his release date. And the next thing you know, Susan's casket was miraculously dropped off at a funeral home in Oklahoma by some anonymous folk, and Tony was soon freed under supervised release. Free from prison and ready to marry the new child brides he had just picked out of the catalog he requested, Tony would wed himself to them in his bedroom, where he then expected them to consummate the marriage. Mind you, some of these little girls range from 8 years old up to teenagers. During these times, they were scared and in pain, but Tony threatened to kill them if they fought back. Outside of these situations, he would berate them for no reason, and it seemed like he hated them more than anything. He was unpredictable and would sometimes stay in his room for days at a time, neglecting them, and then randomly wake them up in the middle of the night to preach at them. If he thought they even looked at him funny, he would make them stay in a greenhouse in the backyard, also known as the House of Scorn. Otherwise, they pretty much stayed inside 24/7. Some of the girls girls tried to tell their parents that they wanted to come home, but were denied, with the parents saying that Tony was the ultimate decision maker. Tony had previously kept records on paper or tapes so that they couldn't be traced, but after he got out of prison, he decided that he wanted cameras recording all compounds at all times so that members couldn't get into any trouble. This went on for about 10 years until 2006, when some of his wives had enough of the abuse and used their youthful physicality to escape. The youngest wife, who was married at only 8 years old, came forward telling the FBI everything, including the fact that Tony would take nude Polaroids of the girls, which is obviously illegal. Tony also had glaucoma, and as if this pervert producing and looking at CP isn't disturbing enough, imagine him sitting at his computer hunched over his desk with it blown up, magnified on the screen. Members who did manage to escape felt great shame and embarrassment for their actions and beliefs while under the brainwashing of the Alamos. Some went onto online forums and revealed the truth of what really happened so that others would be dissuaded from falling into the same traps. The advertising of a happy religious community that was serving God was actually an abusive cult, and specifically that Tony Alamo was a sexual predator. The FBI learned that he had crossed state lines with a minor for sexual purposes when he took his then 11-year-old wife to the California compound and violated her in the car on the way there. Authorities obtained a search warrant, and armed federal and state agencies raided the Arkansas compound on September 20th, Tony's birthday. Tony had actually shown the members a documentary about the Waco Branch Davidian incident and had warned them that it pretty much predicted their future.
Government today, they say it's the wrong thing to be a Christian. That's why they killed all those people at Waco. Those people didn't do anything wrong there.
And this was one prediction that he was actually finally onto something. Tony wasn't there during the raid. He had already taken off on the run, of course, and at the same time, he was calling in live to Fox and CNN, explaining that he had done nothing wrong.
Are you in Arkansas at this time?
In Arkansas? No.
Where are you right now?
On Earth.
Which city are you in?
What is it your business?
He got very angry when reporters were like, sir, what is all this about young girls and marrying them? And
the Bible states that the legal age for marriage is at puberty. I'm not married to any teenage girls who don't want to be. I'm 74 years old.
I don't remember reading that in the Bible, sir, and I went to Bible class every Sunday school, and I don't remember saying anything about it.
Kids
are reaching puberty at the age of 12.
You don't know anything about the Bible.
Going to hell? And hold on.
The law of God is what you're going to be judged by, and everybody else on this earth.
That's fine, sir, but let me just ask you
it's not only fine, it's going to really happen, okay?
Well, thank you, sir.
Yeah, Grandpa, take your meds and hang up the phone. He got very angry at this. Meanwhile, police detained his wives back at the compound, who were mortified. At the house, cops found film without anything on them, as he had told his wives to delete all the evidence when he had suspected that the raid was going to happen, as well as Viagra, ovulation tests, and multiple wedding rings. Authorities filed to take custody of all of the minors under the Alamo Ministries and place them into foster care since they didn't have any other family outside of the organization. This was enough for some members to leave in order to regain custody of their children, but on the other hand, many stayed, leaving their kids in foster care. Tony was eventually found in Flagstaff, Arizona, leaving a hotel room, but police didn't have as much evidence as they hoped. Tony was transferred to Arkansas, where 5 of his child brides testified against him on 10 counts of transportation of a minor for sex. As the girls held hands awaiting the results, Tony was found guilty on all 10 counts and sentenced to 175 years in prison. His victims cried tears of joy that day. Over the years, Tony has received several civil lawsuits for child abuse, totaling over $1.1 billion owed to his victims. His assets are still being seized to recompensate them, but it'll probably never be recomped, if we're being honest. Once Tony went to prison, he believed that he was immortal, which is great. If you want to spend 175 years in prison, then by all means go ahead. But it turns out he was not immortal at all, as his health deteriorated during his 8 years in prison, and at the age of 82, he died on May 2nd in 2017. Even in death, Tony still has a few followers, including a few of his wives who recruit new members to this day. I'm not sure how their operations have changed since Tony's death, but considering his legacy is being carried on by people who were indoctrinated since birth, I imagine abuse could still be ongoing. Survivors of the foundation that managed to escape are forever scarred by their time with the Alamos, whether it be physically, mentally, emotionally, all of the above. Family ties unraveled, faith became fear, and they were pushed into a society that they weren't prepared to live in. Nowadays, the charismatic cult leader types have even a larger reach right at their fingertips, thanks to the internet and social media opening people up to groups like Nixium, the FLDS, and QAnon from the comfort of their home, or can even lead them into dangerous situations like human trafficking. With that, we've just about reached the end of today's case, and I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to click this video out of all of the options on YouTube, because we know there's a lot. If you enjoyed this video and you're into cults, true crime, strange occurrences, things like that, consider hitting the subscribe button down below to keep up with me. Hit that like button, it helps me out a lot, and I will go ahead and see you in the next one. Alright guys, bye!
In this world